Welcome to this episode of Religion and American Life, a podcast by the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. I am Father Mark Massa, the director of the Blasey Center and today's podcast host. This podcast is an initiative of the Blasey Center's commitment to connecting a community of scholars, policymakers, media, and religious leaders in conversation and scholarly reflection around issues at the intersection of religion and American public life. Today, we are joined by a scholar of Jewish-Christian relations and is currently the instructor of a course entitled Anti-Semitism, Racism, and Christian Nationalism. And Dan will be joining us to talk about the rise of Christian nationalism in the United States. Professor Daniel Joslyn-Siemiatkoski is the Kraft Family Professor and Director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. He's a scholar of Jewish-Christian relations and comparative theology and is the author of many books. His research interests include Jewish-Christian relations, both ancient and modern, comparative theology, the intersection of anti-Judaism and racism, and Anglican theologies of religion. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure to be here.
My own question begins from my own field. As you know, I'm a scholar of American religion. There was always, at least since the mid or early 19th century, there was something that religion scholars called civil religion in the United States. And civil religion was always considered the spiritual glue. So whether you were a Baptist or a Catholic or Jewish, there was a form of spiritual values that transcended those denominational religions that we called civil religion. And Will Herberg, of course, famously called it the American way of life. So that tied Americans together, that was devoted to democracy, fair play, education, all those things. In your opinion, what is the relation between the older civil religion and Christian nationalism as we see it today?
Both of them posit, I think, that America has a special role to play in the world. You can't find an American president or presidential candidate who's successful who's not going to posit that. So I saw that with Kamala Harris's DNC convention speech, for example. I think what American Christian nationalism is really kind of a counterpoint that in some ways has run throughout American religious history, which is the notion that American exceptionalism posits the existence of other enemies who must be controlled and conquered. And Christian nationalism is very concerned with the enemy from within. Those things that pollute the body politic and that need to be expunged in order for America to live up to its divine mission. So this is why you can find forms of Christian nationalism that move into anti-Semitism. You can find forms of it that are anti-Catholic. This kind of xenophobic moment we're in can also speak to that as well. And most potently, the supposition that there are others who aren't true Christians who also need to be expunged from power as well.
Dan is a member of an interdisciplinary faculty seminar that meets that I'm part of as well. And we've been reading about Christian nationalism. Now, some people say that the older civil religion, which celebrated American exceptionalism, by which we mean America has a special relationship to God and America has a special divine mission to the world, that the older civil religion was positive and had positive vibes, whereas the current Christian nationalism often has very negative. In other words, the older civil religion was unifying and the current Christian nationalism is divisive. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I even extend that. So even with like Will Herberg's, Protestant Catholic Jew hypothesis of this kind of like post-Cold War consensus, I mean, part of that is also saying there's going to be a homogenizing of religious identity in some ways to fit this national mission. So I think Will Herberg's ideal Jew doesn't look quite like the many forms of Jewish diversity we actually have on the ground. The same with the ideal form of Protestantism or the ideal form of Catholicism and that kind of hypothesis of civil religion. So I think there's a homogenizing force at play there. Whereas Christian nationalism is very focused on particularity. There's one form of religion, there's one truth, and everything else needs to be sublimated to that. I point this out with what's happening on the far edge of the conservative movement, which is a bit of a civil war happening over anti-Semitism, uh, where you have a battle that happened between Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens over anti-Semitism. And Candace Owens really kind of declaring essentially that Jews are part of the problem in America, and Jews need to be subservient to an American Christian order. And Ben Shapiro, who's a very conservative Jew, really pushing strongly back against that. And so we see the fracturing even more greatly of the civil religion consensus on the far edges of the conservative spectrum right now.
Now, there's been a number of polls out, and a number of them say that either majority or a strong minority of self-described Christian nationalists are not church members, and then they do not describe themselves as religious, as personally religious. So how do you explain that strange juxtaposition of commitment to Christian nationalism, but also sort of disavowal of religion?
Yeah, this is one of the concerning elements with kind of, I would say, really the global far right, which is really a promotion of Western chauvinism and the amplification of Christian identity as a Western cultural identity that is going to be used in order to make other peoples and cultures subservient to it. So in some quarters, this is an embrace of a very strong reactionary Catholic identity. In some quarters, this is a very strong embrace, especially in the United States, of this kind of fundamentalist Christian reading of the past. And so the point isn't really being Christian. The point is the cultural identity to which Christianity is attached. And I think that's part of what helps us make sense of some of those polling numbers. And this goes to this deeper question of, are they really Christian? And I'm of the school of thought of, if someone says they're Christian, they're Christian.
Right.
And that is more of a self-descriptive identity versus kind of these internal confessional litmus tests that we might use. And I'm speaking of that way, not in theological terms, but in sociological terms.
How would you juxtapose or interpret the relationship of Christian nationalism to the older ideology of the Ku Klux Klan? How are they different?
It's very interesting because the Klan, of course, was opposed to African American emancipation, liberation, but then as it reemerges in the 1920s, is also opposed to Jewish identities and Catholic identities because of the forms of immigration advancing. So the Klan, in a way, was a kind of resurgent nativism. What's different about Christian nationalism is its willingness to include, ironically, people of color. One of the leaders of the Proud Boys, Tarico, is of Puerto Rican ancestry, for instance, to notionally view Judaism as fitting somewhere positively in a Christian identity, though perhaps subservient in some way. And there's the role of Catholics, who are also part of the Christian nationalist movement. And so the idea here now is not that any one of these groups are inimical to the Christian nationalist movement, but their presence needs to be supportive of the overall ideology. So if they begin to raise questions, like, say, Ben Shapiro did about, what was circulating in far-right circles was starting to use last spring this tagline in social media spaces, Christ is King, meaning Christ is King of America. And so a person like Ben Shapiro, a far-right personality who's Jewish, said, I don't fit into that tagline. And a person like Candace Owens, who is an African-American woman, saying, you have to, because it's the Christian identity that is the focus point for America, and you essentially are here on our good graces. And so that, I think, begins to get into some of the fissure points around the contradictions of the Christian nationalist movement in America today.
A number of TV pundits and journalists describe Christian nationalism as a form of white nationalism. You would take issue with that then?
It's not exclusively so. You can find white nationalists or Christian nationalism. I think you need to envision a more diffuse movement, envision a Venn diagram, if you will, where different people locate within a spectrum of this identity.
You're saying Christian nationalists are a loose coalition of people with various loyalties.
Yes, yes. White nationalism can fit within that, but some white nationalists are actually hostile to Christian identity itself. So again, getting our arms around this was really a diffuse movement is important.
And so, what is the relation of Christian nationalism to anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism?
I think we need to start with the ways in which supersessionist Christian thinking operates. So supersessionism is essentially the assertion that the church has replaced the Jewish people as the ones in whom God is in covenant with. You can reduce it to the tagline, the church is now Israel. This operates in the Latin Western tradition in really powerful ways. I like to point to the ways in which pre-modern England strongly identified with the English people as a new Israel. We find this in the Venerable Bede's writings in kind of the early modern period. We find it operating strongly throughout various iterations of the English religious imagination. And so the Puritans in the early 17th century begin to really take hold, especially with the ways in which Reformed theology operates, with imagining a continuity of covenant between Israel and the church. And so it's no mistake that when John Winthrop writes his model of Christian charity out in Boston Harbor, probably 10 miles away from where Boston College is located now, he speaks about these people who are embarking essentially as new Israelites into a new land of Canaan. And so this imagination of America as a new Israel is really powerful. So what that means then is that anything about Judaism is instrumentalized in Christian nationalist thinking. And so that sets the stage for anti-Semitic dispositions like we saw with this dispute over this rallying cry this year of Christ is King. That is, Jews need to find their place within the Christian economy, and no space can really be made for Jews and their own abiding covenantal relationship with God. All of that needs to be subsumed under Christ's kingship.
And do you think those chants in Charlottesville a number of years ago where protesters were chanting, Jews will not replace us, Jews will not replace us, not related to all of this?
It is, although I think the Charlottesville event really was not a Christian nationalist event. That was really organized by Richard Spencer, who's not Christian, who was very much part of that far right, specifically white nationalist neo-Nazi movement. They were talking about the Great Replacement theory that was first promulgated in France, targeted towards Muslims. But that Great Replacement theory idea, and the idea that globalists are behind the surge of immigrants and refugees to the United States that the Democratic Party is exploiting to alter the composition of America, gets targeted in anti-Semitic ways. So the very phrase globalists, George Soros, as a financier behind this, who is Jewish, point towards these anti-Semitic ideas of a global Jewish conspiracy. Lately, there's been some things in some of these circles targeting Doug Emhoff, the second gentleman, who's Jewish and the husband of Kamala Harris, and hypothesizing how he is part of a plot with this Great Replacement theory. And so people like Tucker Carlson begin to parrot this, and Tucker Carlson is actually a member of my own denomination, the Episcopal Church. And so what we think as extremist movements can actually begin to find their way into what we structures that we begin to understand as like mainstream Christianity.
Interesting. So if you would, we've been talking about many groups under the larger category of Christian nationalists. Could you break Christian nationalism down? Like what what are the major groups or what are the major ideologies that together would compose the group we call Christian nationalism now?
So we would put towards one end what we would call the sort of extremist Catholic movements, some adjacent to Catholic integralism, but not all Catholic integralists fall into this.
Catholic integralists pick up a theme that came out of European Catholicism in the 19th century, and that is the belief that separation of church and state and freedom of religion was a mistake. That the First Amendment to the Constitution in the United States was a mistake, and there should be only one church that people are free to belong to. So the name itself, integralism, comes in the belief that church and state should be integrated. Every state should have just one church, so that only the Catholic Church in the United States should be officially recognized, and therefore everybody become a Catholic. So integralists believe that the First Amendment was a mistake, that the Revolution was a mistake, and that we should go back to the kind of throne and altar unity that defined 1,000 years of Christianity.
Yeah, the kind of ultramontanism view. You also have people like Nick Fuentes, who is more of a hard right Catholic figure on a populist level. He was actually an undergraduate at BU. He did participate in Charlottesville, and he left Boston University after Charlottesville in 2017, I believe at the age of 19 or 20. He has quite an extensive far-right platform. He is Latino and deeply anti-Semitic. And so that's one section. We would have our various evangelical / fundamentalists. So you can find forms of Christian nationalism embedded in most forms of evangelicalism, though again, not all forms of it are. I was raised in an evangelical context in the Methodist Church in Connecticut. Looking back on that in the late 70s or into the 80s, I realized I was really raised in kind of a Christian nationalist adjacent moment. This is the moment of Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority and Phil Schlafly, Pat Robertson. These were all kind of early figures that were beginning to coalesce this. We have within the Reformed church movement in the United States, especially among the Dutch Reformed, a very strong Christian nationalist movement that is sort of like Catholic integralism that came out of post-war thinking in Dutch theology that really began to again argue for the reintegration of church and state, according to kind of the old classic Calvinist lines. Now, finally, we have a movement among Pentecostals. And Matthew Taylor has just come out with a new book that goes over this. It's called the Seven Mountain Theory, which is about how there's like the seven mountains are the kind of the seven structures of any given society: politics, culture, entertainment, law, business, church, schools, etc. And having a vision about how all of these different aspects need to be captured by Christians. And they're very well organized. It's part of what's called the New Apostolic Movement. Some of Trump's advisors in his first administration were part of this movement. We're part of the New Apostolic Movement, and we're definitely working with this Christian nationalist models. And it's that final element of the last two I mentioned, the Reformed theological traditions and these new Pentecostal traditions that, to me, appear to be the most organized and coherent, even though largely unseen by mainstream culture and media.
Interesting. So would you argue then that some of the roots of the current Christian nationalist movement were the moral majority and focus on the family, those kind of evangelical
yeah, I'd label it more neo-evangelical into fundamentalist. Again, I would say that there's been, I don't want to get too binary American here, but I think there's been two parallel streams of American religious thought. There's been the civil religion stream, and then there's been this dissenting stream that says, actually, no, America is meant to have a much more aggressive and coherent and exclusively Christian identity. What happened in the 1920s with the Scopes monkey trial and the failure of some of those kind of early movements, essentially, as you know, Mark, that they went underground, or not underground, but they retreated socially, And over a period of 40 to 50 years, they developed a coherent movement and set of ideological principles, and then reemerged starting in the late 70s to exercise more social power. And they explicitly saw as generational work. And I'd say we're now into the third generation of that work, and we're beginning to see now a reorientation of the landscape as a result.
What is your sense of how politically or culturally dangerous the current Christian nationalism? If you read the Times or other media, it would, there's a sense that this is a very serious, large threat to American democracy and separation of church and state. Would you agree with that?
It depends on what day of the week it is and how I'm feeling. I think it depends on location and context. So I first want to talk about the ways in which these movements are very focused on local control. So the capture of school boards, the capture of town governments, and then that works its way up to state levels and state houses, legislatures, governments. I think it's much harder to do kind of capture on the federal level, just given the diffuse nature of the structures of American government. What concerns me, though, is that there could be enough people close to levers of power that do enough to do things. So do you want to know like my nightmare scenario? I'll share this with you. So it's that there's a close election in November. It appears that Vice President Harris won the election, but that the state legislatures take advantage of some of the ambiguities in constitutional law about how electoral votes are counted at the state level. That state governments shift it to Trump. That in itself, that breakdown of constitutional process is enough of a concern for me. But then once this administration's in place, I think perhaps a little bit Project 2025 is overblown, but I think there's enough of it in there to give one pause. And here's my real concern, is that a new constitutional convention is called. And this has been part of the project on the far right, is actually a restructuring the U.S. Constitution. And I think that's when we get into crisis moment. I think a Trump administration part two that looked like the 2016 Trump administration will cause concern for a variety of people. But if it was just a 2016 version, that wouldn't be the concern. The concern for me is that there's enough Christian nationalists who realize, okay, this time around, we're going to push the ball further down the field. And my concern is what's done to constitutional structures of the government.
Certainly people like Vermeule and Deneen, who are prominent Catholic integralists, would be in favor of a new constitutional convention and revisit the whole idea of separation of church and state and freedom of religion. Who else would join the Catholic integralist group in calling for a kind of new constitutional convention and a reconsideration of the amendments to the Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Southern Baptist Convention would, which has largely been captured by Christian nationalists. This was the whole thing that played out during the Trump administration was, Baptist theology is based on the principle of soul freedom, is what they call it, that every person has the right to choose their religious beliefs. And people like Russell Moore, who spoke out against some of the seeming issues of violation of freedom of religion that were being promulgated, were silenced by the Southern Baptist Convention. And so I think we see structures like that. I think a lot of the grassroots evangelical networks would also be advocating for this as well.
So you would see this as a genuine threat and just not a media-generated threat?
I think it's within the world of probability, but in order for it to happen, I think there are several steps down the line before we get to that issue. So it's one of those things where it's a concern, but I don't think that it is necessarily the thing that will happen if, say, Kamala Harris is not elected the next president. I think a number of other cascading events would have to happen first.
Now, Dan, you're an Episcopal priest. As you know, I'm a Jesuit priest. Would you ever preach about this on the pulpit?
I did preach about Christian nationalism over the summer. And this is actually the House of Bishops of the Episcopal Church this week are releasing a teaching document on Christian nationalism. So this has actually been something that the Episcopal Church and a number of other mainline Protestant denominations have sought to issue explicit teachings about. So this is certainly worthy of preaching on. I think when one preaches on political issues, replicating partisanship in the culture is extremely unhelpful. Rather, the importance is reorienting the congregation towards Christian virtues, especially hope. Hope is one, and then charity is the other. I'm using charity instead of love because I think that focuses kind of the attention on the theological language. And so, actually, after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, and we're in the midst of the calls, I preached the morning when Biden announced he would not run again. It was a few hours before. I really spoke about how, in this political moment, the challenge is how do you love your enemy? Because I think the partisanship is so high that people on both sides find the love of enemy to be anathema. And especially in progressive circles. I mean, not especially. I think that is true in progressive circles. Acts of expressing empathy or desires to reach out or to engage in some kind of reconciliation are often resisted. And so for congregants who are living in progressive areas like Cambridge, for them to actually begin to exhibit qualities of charity and love towards their enemy is in its own way very countercultural. It's not the same as the problems of Christian nationalism, but I think it speaks to some of the deeper spiritual issues that are at play in our society today.
You're a pretty good reader of the culture, in my experience. If you were a betting person, what would you bet is going to happen to Christian nationalism? It's sort of a loose federation of people with various loyalties, but now have some cultural power. If you were a betting person, where do you think that's going to go?
I think it's been normalized enough in the Republican Party, and I say that objectively, that I think you will consistently have, especially in the House of Representatives, people who articulate various elements of a Christian nationalist agenda. So the question then is, to what degree will they find partners in the agenda they seek to promote? You know, Mike Johnson is essentially a Christian nationalist, the Speaker of the House. The paralysis in Congress is preventing anything from actually happening, which usually is bad, but here might be good. And so I really think it depends on how Congress shapes up and whether the current gridlock exists. And also how the voting power of Gen Z and millennials evolves and shifts as the baby boomer and silent generation continue to recede from political power.
Dan, how do you think Christian nationalist ideas or impulses have shaped public education in the United States?
Right. So I think one of the reasons why we've seen a push towards Christian nationalism moving to public education is actually a backlash against the George Floyd movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the publishing of the 1619 Project. The publishing of the 1619 Project, I think, is going to go down as kind of a watershed in the political culture of America in the early 21st century, because I think it lit a spark that alerted people in this movement towards the importance of continuing to capture public education. So essentially what the 1619 Project was trying to do is offer a more nuanced reading of the founding of America and draw attention to the ways in which the enslavement of African peoples and the prior enslavement and genocide of indigenous peoples was part of the economic engine that led to the development of the United States and was embedded within the political culture. So there were efforts then to prohibit teachings about the history of America that simply made students feel bad. So it's actually a very interesting use in terms of some of the legislative language of kind of our therapeutic culture, that if I feel bad or attacked, then that fact can be ruled as out of bounds. So that was then used to push in Florida various laws around teaching that Governor DeSantis pushed. Governor Abbott and elements of the Board of Education in Texas also pushed strong agendas around this. What's key about Texas and their real push against teaching about race in a more diverse manner in the history of America, a more expansive manner, is Texas and California are the two big buyers of school textbooks. So whatever standards Texas decides are necessary for a school textbook, the publishing company that has a contract with them will follow that. Then they'll have a knock-on effect in many other school districts around the country. And so I think that example is one. And then what's happening back in Florida with this effort to really purge the Florida higher education system of diversity regarding teaching about race and gender has had a really chilling effect, especially what's happened at the new college in Florida. I think is instructive of the ways in which Christian nationals' capture of state educational systems can play out.
Right. And New College, for those who are listening and don't remember, Governor DeSantis decided that New College had been captured by a group of radical leftists, and therefore he replaced the trustees with his hand-picked trustees, and now they actually installed a completely new curriculum to sort of offer a very different kind of structured education. New College was always considered the lefty instantiation of the Florida state system. That kind of action that Governor DeSantis did, do you think it's possible that other colleges and universities will follow that route?
Well, I think other governors, if they have the ability to, will try to implement that in their state university systems. I think a place like Missouri, Tennessee. I know there's a lot of concerns in Missouri, particularly about what's happening within the state university structures.
Dan Joslyn-Siemiatkoski, as you can see, is a very smart fellow. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for listening to Religion and American Life, a podcast by the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. For more information on the work of the Boise Center, the Center's schedule of events, or to listen to other episodes of this podcast, please visit our website at bc.edu/BOISI.